From the first second she walked into that place, every eye turned towards her. It wasn't just presence. It was as if she carried a secret so heavy that each step echoed louder than the silence around her. And the more she tried to hide, the more impossible it became. It seemed that at any moment something would happen and nothing would ever be the same again. But what no one expected was the exact moment when everything collapsed. A single detail, a simple gesture was enough to tear away the veil of mystery and transform that entire room into a sea of shock, shame, and whispers. And it was there, before everyone, that her life changed forever. And the worst part, what came afterwards was even more devastating. The silence of the funeral at Glasnevin Cemetery was interrupted only by the creaking of wooden chairs as Aimee Santos, daughter of Filipino immigrants, knelt before the coffin. With trembling hands, she placed a worn rosary upon the chest of the elderly woman she had cared for over the years. The instant her fingers opened, the cord broke in funeral silence, and a golden wedding ring rolled across the cold chapel floor, stopping at the feet of a woman in a black dress. The tension exploded in the second moment. Siobhan O'Hara, daughter of powerful CEO Declan O'Hara, bent down slowly, lifted the ring, and read aloud the inscription engraved inside. Declan and Aimee, Galway, 2022. The sound echoed like a sentence. Eyes met, whispers rose like flames. "So it's true. My father married the secretary," Siobhan murmured, with a cold smile that pierced Aimee's heart. Father Kieran, who was celebrating the mass, stopped the homily, fixing his gaze on Aimee, who remained motionless, kneeling, her face burning with shame. Everyone present, neighbors, colleagues, the CEO's relatives, stared at her as if she were an imposter. Aimee took a deep breath, trying to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. The last audible sound was the cutting voice of her mother-in-law, Mora Ní Riain, echoing from the back of the chapel. "Explain yourself, or everyone here will believe you stole what doesn't belong to you." The heavy chapel door burst open suddenly, and everyone turned, awaiting Aimee's response. But she wasn't the first to speak. The air in Glasnevin felt thick, suffocating. Aimee's throat tightened as dozens of eyes bore into her like daggers. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the familiar sting of being different, of being judged. How many times had she walked through Dublin feeling invisible, just another immigrant trying to belong? But now, kneeling in this ancient chapel amongst Dublin's most respected families, she had never felt more exposed. The rosary beads scattered across the floor seemed to mock her, each one a prayer she'd whispered for acceptance, for belonging, for love. She had cared for the elderly woman with devotion, bathing her, feeding her, reading to her when no one else would. And now, even in death, that woman's final gift to her had become a weapon of humiliation. Siobhan's perfectly manicured hand still held the ring aloft like a prosecutor presenting damning evidence. The young woman's designer dress, her confident posture, her entitled sneer, everything about her screamed old money, true Irish bloodlines, the kind of legitimacy Aimee could never claim. Behind Siobhan, other mourners leaned forward in their pews, hungry for scandal, their faces alive with the thrill of witnessing someone's downfall. Father Kieran shifted uncomfortably at the altar, his weathered face creased with concern. He had known the deceased woman well, had heard her confessions, understood her secrets. His fingers tightened around his prayer book as he watched the scene unfold, powerless to stop the cruelty blossoming in his sacred space. Mora Ní Riain stood at the back like a sentinel of judgment, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. She had never hidden her disdain for Aimee, the foreign secretary who had somehow ensnared her son. Now vindication glittered in her cold blue eyes. The whispers grew louder, more vicious. Gold digger, opportunist, shameless. The words slithered through the pews like serpents. Aimee wanted to scream, to defend herself, to explain that her love for Declan was real, that she had never asked for wealth or status, only to be seen as human. But her voice had abandoned her, trapped somewhere between her racing heart and her paralyzed tongue. Outside, rain began to fall on the ancient tombstones, drops pattering against stained glass windows that had witnessed centuries of Irish grief and gossip. Inside, a different kind of storm was breaking, one that would drown Aimee in shame if she didn't find her voice soon. But before she could utter a single word of defense, The chapel door groaned open with such force that several mourners gasped. All heads turned towards the entrance, where a figure stood silhouetted against the gray Dublin afternoon. The sudden entrance revealed Declan O'Hara himself, his face pale, his black suit disheveled. He walked towards the altar with rigid steps, as if he were just another mourner. But the hundreds of eyes fixed upon him transformed that space into a courtroom. Eimir, without courage to lift her gaze, felt her throat go dry as Declan extended his hand to take the ring from his daughter's fingers. The tension sharpened. Holding the object, Declan didn't return it to his pocket. Instead, he held it tight between his fingers, allowing the light to pass through the gold and reveal the inscription to everyone. A collective gasp swept through the chapel. The confirmation needed no words. The candles flickered as Father Kieran cleared his throat, trying to restore solemnity. But the funeral had transformed into spectacle. Mora Ní Riain advanced, her dark veil trembling over her shoulders. "You have shamed this family before God and everyone. Marrying in secret with someone like her?" The whisper spread like weeds. Neighbors, journalists, even company employees murmured. Eimir, once invisible, was now the center of public shame. Declan's hand trembled slightly as he continued to hold the ring aloft. His jaw clenched, the muscle twitching beneath his graying stubble. For years he had commanded boardrooms, negotiated million-euro deals, faced down competitors with cold precision. But here, in this chapel filled with judgment and betrayal, he looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or retreat. Siobhan stepped back, her expression shifting from triumph to confusion. She had expected her father to deny everything, to dismiss the ring as a mistake, to protect the family name above all else. Instead, he simply stood there, letting the evidence speak for itself. The silence between father and daughter stretched taut, years of unspoken resentment suddenly visible to everyone present. "You owe us an explanation," Mora hissed, moving closer to her son. Her voice carried the weight of generations of O'Hara pride, of respectability built on careful marriages and proper alliances. "That woman," she spat the word like poison, "is half your age, from God knows where, with nothing to her name but a nursing certificate. What possessed you?" Eimir finally found the strength to lift her head. Through blurred vision, she saw Declan's profile, the strong nose, the tired eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair. She remembered the first time he'd looked at her not as the secretary, but as someone worth knowing. It had been after a long night at the office, both of them exhausted, sharing tea in the empty break room. He'd asked about her family in Manila, really listened when she spoke about her mother's struggle with illness, her father's sacrifice working abroad. For the first time in Dublin, someone had seen her as more than just hired help. But now, as photographers' phones rose discreetly to capture the scene, as reporters scribbled furiously in notebooks, Eimir understood the price of that visibility. She had become a story, a scandal, a cautionary tale about foreign women and wealthy Irish men. The chapel felt smaller with each passing second, the walls pressing in, the air growing stale with judgment. Father Kieran descended from the altar, his robes rustling in the heavy silence. "Perhaps," he said gently, "we might continue this after we've paid proper respects to the deceased." His eyes darted nervously between Declan and Mora, between Eimir and the growing crowd of onlookers. The old woman in the coffin deserved better than to have her funeral hijacked by family drama. But Mora ignored him. "Answer me, Declan. Did you marry this immigrant behind our backs? In Galway of all places where your grandmother's people are buried?" Before Declan could respond, before the chapel could descend further into chaos, something unexpected happened. Father Kieran bent down, his old knees cracking with the effort, and retrieved a small envelope that had fallen from the deceased woman's belongings. The envelope was yellowed with age, sealed with red wax that had cracked over time. His weathered fingers traced the name written across the front in shaky handwriting. "To Declan O'Hara, to be opened after my death." The priest's face went pale as he recognized the handwriting. His eyes lifted to meet Eimir's, and in that brief exchange she saw something that made her blood run cold. Knowledge. Father Kieran knew something. Something contained in that envelope. Something that could change everything. He clutched the letter to his chest, making a decision in that moment. "This," he said quietly, "is not the time or place, but there are things that must be said, truths that must be told. Come to St. Mary's Pro-Cathedral tomorrow. All of you. His gaze swept across Declan, Maura, Chauvin, and finally rested on Ymir with unexpected kindness. The dead have their own testimony to give. 2 days later, fine rain washed the stones of St. Mary's Pro-Cathedral, where Father Kieran called Ymir in private. He opened the yellowed envelope before her, a letter written by the elderly woman who had passed, addressed to Declan O'Hara. The wavering handwriting revealed a truth hidden for decades. It was she who had financed, with her savings as a domestic worker, Declan's first studies in Galway. Ymir held the letter with trembling fingers and noticed that her own mother's name, an immigrant nurse, appeared as a witness in the footnotes. Her family, without ever revealing it, had been an essential part of the success of the man who now felt ashamed of her in public. The shock took her breath away. "This changes everything," the priest murmured. "But be careful, Ymir. If you reveal this letter, not only will Declan be exposed, but the reputation of the entire company will collapse. And those who suffer first are always the poorest, the employees." Ymir felt torn. Save her dignity or protect those who depended on the company? The dilemma gnawed at her. The cathedral's dim light filtered through stained glass, casting colored shadows across the ancient letter. Ymir's hands shook as she read her mother's name, Rosa Santos, written in faded ink beside a date from 1998, 27 years ago. Before Ymir was even born, her mother had been part of this story, a silent witness to a transaction that would shape all their futures. Father Kieran settled into the wooden pew beside her, his old bones creaking. "Your mother and Mrs. O'Sullivan, the woman who passed, they worked together at the Mater Hospital. Rosa was barely 20 then, fresh from Manila, cleaning floors at night while studying for her nursing qualification. Mrs. O'Sullivan was already elderly, working as a cleaner despite her age, saving every penny." "Why?" Ymir whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would they help him? He was nobody to them. Because they saw potential where others saw only another struggling student. Declan was brilliant, everyone knew that. But his family had nothing. His mother, Maura's husband's first wife, had died young, leaving him to be raised by relatives who barely tolerated him. Mrs. O'Sullivan saw him at church, noticed how thin he was, how his shoes had holes. She and your mother, they made a pact." The priest's words painted a picture Ymir had never imagined. Her mother, young and far from home, choosing to share her meager wages with an Irish boy she barely knew. The generosity felt almost incomprehensible in a city that had given them so little welcome. "How much?" Ymir asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "Enough to pay for his first year at university. Enough for books, for accommodation, for the suit he wore to his first job interview. Without them, he would have ended up in the building sites, another bright mind lost to circumstance." Father Kieran's eyes grew distant. "Mrs. O'Sullivan made me promise to give you this letter only after her death. She said you'd need it someday, though she never explained why she was so certain." Ymir's mind raced. This letter was power. Power to expose Declan's hypocrisy, to prove that he owed his entire empire to the very kind of immigrant woman he now seemed ashamed to call his wife. She could walk into that parliamentary hearing, read these words aloud, watch his carefully constructed world crumble. The thought brought a bitter satisfaction. But then she thought of the faces she'd seen at the company Christmas party last year, the security guards, the cleaners, the junior staff who'd greeted her warmly despite knowing she was just the secretary. Many were immigrants like her, Polish, Nigerian, Brazilian, Filipino. They'd found stable work, could pay their rent, send money home to families who depended on them. If O'Hara Technologies collapsed under scandal, they'd be the first to lose everything. "What would you do, Father?" she asked, her voice small in the vast cathedral. The old priest was quiet for a long moment. Rain drummed against the windows, Dublin's eternal tears. "I'd ask myself which matters more, being proved right or doing right. But I'm not the one who's been humiliated, my child. That choice must be yours." Ymir folded the letter carefully, slipping it into her handbag. Her phone felt heavy in her pocket, a constant reminder of the outside world waiting to devour her next move. Every journalist in Ireland wanted her story. Every gossip column had theories about the gold-digging secretary. Even strangers on Grafton Street had stared at her yesterday, whispering behind their hands. She stood to leave, but Father Kieran caught her arm gently. "One more thing. Maura knows about this letter. Or at least she knows something existed between her husband's family and Mrs. O'Sullivan. That's why she's so frightened. The O'Hara name isn't as pure as they pretend. Before Ymir could process this revelation, her phone vibrated insistently in her pocket. She pulled it out and her stomach dropped. A notification glowed on the screen. RT Primetime had just published a breaking story. Her name was in the headline, bold and accusatory, and beneath it a small audio file icon with the words, "Listen to the secretary's confession." Her fingers went numb. The cathedral walls seemed to tilt around her. The RTE Primetime headline screamed, "Filipino secretary married CEO in secret for money. Listen to the audio." Ymir, with frozen hands, clicked. The recording was clear, her own voice saying, with irony distorted by editing, "I married Declan for the money, of course." Ymir remembered that day exactly. The phrase had been said as a joke to a friend, but now, isolated, it seemed like a confession. The audio was running across social media, the comments were cruel, and neighbors looked at her on the street with disdain. Desperate, Ymir sought Declan at his penthouse in Ballsbridge but found only Chauvin, his daughter, who stared at her coldly. "Did you really think you could be part of this family? Now everyone knows who you really are." Ymir tried to defend herself, but Chauvin let slip something that made her blood run cold. "If my grandmother could speak, she'd reveal the secret my mother buried decades ago, and you wouldn't have the courage to stay." Before Ymir could ask what that meant, she heard the door open behind her, and Maura Riane's voice, laden with venom, whispered, "It's time you learned the truth about who your husband really is." The audio had been playing on repeat in Ymir's mind since she'd first heard it that morning. How had someone recorded her? Where had they been? She remembered now. It was at Teresa's flat in Phibsborough 3 months ago, over wine and exhausted laughter after a particularly difficult week. Teresa had been joking about office gossip, asking if Ymir had snagged the boss for his wallet. They'd both laughed and Ymir had played along with the absurd suggestion, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh yes, I married Declan for the money, of course. That's why we had a tiny ceremony with just 2 witnesses and I'm still taking the bus to work." But someone had been recording. Someone had stripped away the context, the laughter, the obvious irony, leaving only those damning words. Now they were everywhere. WhatsApp groups, Twitter threads, Facebook comment sections filled with vitriol. Foreign women always have an angle. She trapped him with an anchor baby next, watch. Send her back where she came from. The journey to Ballsbridge had felt like walking through hostile territory. The taxi driver had recognized her from the news, his eyes in the rear-view mirror filled with contempt. He'd driven in pointed silence, taking the longest route possible, as if her presence contaminated his vehicle. Now, standing in Declan's minimalist penthouse, facing Chauvin's icy contempt, Ymir felt the last threads of her composure fraying. The younger woman stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Dublin skyline glittering behind her like a crown. Everything about her screamed entitlement. The cashmere jumper that probably cost more than Ymir's monthly salary, the inherited cheekbones, the confidence of someone who'd never been made to feel small. "Declan's not here," Chauvin said, examining her manicured nails. "He's meeting with lawyers, trying to contain the damage you've caused." "I didn't cause this," Ymir managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Someone recorded me without my knowledge, edited my words." "Does it matter?" Chauvin interrupted, her tone bored. "Everyone believes it, because deep down, everyone knows it's true. What else would a secretary from the Philippines want with a man like my father? Love?" She laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Please, you saw an opportunity and you took it. I almost admire the audacity." Ymir's hands clenched at her sides. She wanted to scream, to grab Chauvin by her perfect hair and make her understand what it felt like to be reduced, dismissed, erased. Instead, she said quietly, "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." "I know you're not one of us," Chauvin replied, turning to face her fully. "You never will be. And now, thank God, everyone else knows it too." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ymir felt something inside her crack. Not break, but crack, like ice beginning to thaw. She thought of her mother, scrubbing floors in Irish hospitals, saving money to help a boy she barely knew. She thought of Mrs. O'Sullivan, dying with secrets on her lips. She thought of all the invisible women who'd built this country's wealth without ever receiving recognition. "Your father wasn't always one of you either," Ymir said softly. "Did you know that? The O'Hara name. It's not as pure as your grandmother pretends. Chauvin's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Before Emir could answer, she heard the distinct click of heels on marble. The sound sent ice down her spine. She turned to see Mora Niriane entering through the private lift, her silver hair immaculate, her expression unreadable. The older woman moved with the deliberate grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime commanding rooms. Chauvin, leave us, Mora said, her voice brooking no argument. But grandmother, now. Chauvin hesitated, curiosity warring with obedience, but ultimately she gathered her bag and left through the main door, casting one last venomous glance at Emir. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mora moved to the window, her back to Emir, gazing out at the city below. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. Not warm, but no longer hostile. Tired, perhaps, or something else Emir couldn't identify. You think you know my son? Mora said quietly. You think your little letter from a dead woman makes you powerful. But there are things you don't understand, girl. Things that would break your romantic notions into pieces. Emir's heart hammered. Then tell me. Mora turned, and in the fading afternoon light, she looked older than her 68 years. Very well. It's time you learned the truth about who your husband really is. In the dark sitting room of the penthouse, Mora Niriane closed the door behind Emir, her wrinkled face tense. You think you're the first to be accused of staining this name? Not even Declan is an O'Hara by blood, she said in a low voice, almost venomous. The silence weighed like lead. Emir froze. Her mother-in-law's confession transformed all the contempt into pure hypocrisy. Mora opened a drawer and removed an old faded photograph from Galway. A young man, not her husband, held a baby. Declan. His real father died without ever being recognized. If this secret came to light, our family would have been destroyed. I hid it to protect him. And now you dare expose us? Emir felt her throat burn. What her mother-in-law was throwing at her was, in fact, proof that the weight of the lie was not in her hands, but in the O'Hara family's own. Before she could react, Mora approached, whispering, If you love my son, you'll stay silent. Otherwise, we'll all sink, and the blame will be yours. The photograph trembled in Emir's hands. The man in the picture had Declan's eyes, the same intense gaze, the same sharp jawline, but his clothes marked him as working class. Rough wool jacket, calloused hands visible even in the faded image. He stood outside a small cottage in what looked like rural Galway, holding an infant wrapped in threadbare blankets. On the back, written in pencil, Thomas and baby, 1977. Thomas Brennan, Mora said, her voice hollow. A fisherman. No education, no prospects, no future. But my sister, God rest her foolish soul, she loved him. The older woman's hands shook as she took the photograph back, handling it like evidence at a crime scene. She died in childbirth. Thomas tried to claim the baby, but the family wouldn't allow it. A Brennan raising an O'Hara? Unthinkable. Emir's mind reeled. So you took Declan, raised him as your own? My husband and I had no children. We gave Declan the O'Hara name, the education, the opportunities his real father never could. We saved him from poverty. Mora's voice hardened, and he repaid us by building an empire. Everything he is, he owes to us erasing his shameful origins. But that's exactly what you're doing to me, Emir whispered, the irony hitting her like a physical blow, treating me as shameful, as something to be hidden. Mora's eyes flashed. It's not the same. Declan became an O'Hara. You'll always be Santos no matter what ring you wear. Don't you see? Ireland has changed, yes, but not enough. Not for this. The board members, the investors, the clients, they'll accept you as secretary, perhaps even as mistress. But as wife? As lady of the house? You're asking them to rewrite centuries of understanding about who belongs and who doesn't. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Emir had spent years in Dublin trying to belong, learning the slang, supporting Irish rugby teams, celebrating St. Patrick's Day with genuine enthusiasm. She'd thought love would be enough, that Declan's position would shield them. How naive she'd been. Thomas Brennan, Emir said slowly, testing the name on her tongue. Does Declan know? About his real father? Mora's silence was answer enough. He doesn't, Emir breathed. You've let him live his entire life believing a lie, building his identity on sand. And you call me the fraud? I call you the threat, Mora snapped. stepping closer. Her perfume was expensive, cloying, Chanel something, probably older than Ymir. That letter from Mrs. O'Sullivan, it mentions Thomas. Not by name, but she knew. She was there, cleaning the hospital the night my sister died. She saw everything. If you reveal it, if you expose how Declan's empire was built on immigrant charity and aristocratic lies, we'll all be destroyed. Perhaps you should be, Ymir said quietly. Mora's hand moved so fast Ymir barely saw it coming. The slap cracked across her cheek, sharp and humiliating. The older woman's breathing was ragged, her composure finally shattered. You ungrateful little... The television flickered to life suddenly, making them both jump. The evening news. Mora must have sat on the remote. But what appeared on screen made Ymir's blood turn to ice. Breaking news banner. O'Hara Technologies CEO summoned to testify before Waitress committee. Allegations of financial misconduct and undeclared foreign interests. The reporter's voice filled the room. Declan O'Hara will appear before the Dáil tomorrow to answer questions about his company's tax arrangements and recent controversial marriage to a Filipino national who previously worked as his secretary. Sources suggest the hearing may examine whether personal relationships influenced business decisions. Ymir's phone began vibrating insistently, text after text from numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters. Always reporters. Mora's face had gone gray. They're destroying him, and they'll use you to do it. Every prejudice, every suspicion about foreign women seducing Irish men for status, they'll weaponize it all. Because of what you taught them, Ymir said, her voice shaking. Because people like you spent generations deciding who deserves dignity and who doesn't. Declan's mother loved a fisherman and you couldn't bear it. I love your son, and you can't bear it. The pattern repeats. For a moment something flickered in Mora's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or regret. But it vanished as quickly as it came. Tomorrow, she said coldly, when he testifies, you'll be there, and you'll choose. Destroy him with your truths, or save him with your silence. But understand this, if you speak, hundreds of employees lose their livelihoods. If you stay silent, you lose yourself. Either way, you lose. The door opened again. This time it was Declan himself, his face haggard, his tie loosened. He stopped short, seeing them together. Mother, what are you doing here? Teaching your wife about family loyalty, Mora said, moving past him towards the lift. I hope she's a quick learner. After she left, Declan crossed to Ymir, reaching for her reddened cheek. She flinched away. She hit you? She told me the truth, Ymir said. About Thomas Brennan. About who you really are. Declan's face drained of color. In that moment, Ymir saw him not as the powerful CEO, but as the baby in the photograph. Lost, displaced, built on lies he'd never questioned. The gray Dublin sun reflected off the walls of Leinster House as Declan entered for the hearing. Reporters surrounded the steps. Microphones extended like blades. Ymir, hidden amongst the crowd, clutched the letter from the elderly woman and the photograph Mora had given her. Both truths weighed like stones in her hands. The tension sharpened. When a journalist recognized her, he extended his microphone and asked, "Did you marry in secret for the money? Or will you admit you've deceived all of Ireland?" The world seemed to spin. She didn't answer, only closed her eyes, feeling the wave of humiliation tighten in her chest. Inside, before the committee, Declan faltered. Each question about corruption in the company came loaded with venom. When the committee chairman asked that Ymir be called to testify, a murmur ran through the chamber. She entered with firm steps, though inside she trembled as never before. Everyone expected her to destroy her husband with the evidence she had. The letter from the elderly woman was in her hands. Ymir took a deep breath, faced the committee and said, "Listen to these words. They're not mine, but from someone who can no longer speak." The chamber fell into absolute silence as Ymir unfolded the yellowed paper. Her hands shook, but her voice held steady. Years of being overlooked had taught her to project when it mattered. The committee members leaned forward in their leather chairs. The public gallery packed with journalists whose fingers hovered over keyboards, ready to transmit her words to a nation waiting for scandal. "This letter," Ymir began, her accent suddenly feeling heavier under the weight of so many Irish ears, was written by Mrs. Kathleen O'Sullivan. She passed away last week. Some of you may remember her. She cleaned these very halls for 23 years before her retirement. A rustle of recognition moved through the room. Several older TDs nodded. They'd known Kathleen, the invisible woman who'd emptied their bins, polished their desks, listened to their complaints about pay rises while scrubbing their floors for minimum wage. Imir's eyes found Declan in the witness chair. He looked broken, diminished in his expensive suit. She could destroy him now. One paragraph from this letter would expose the hypocrisy, reveal that his entire fortune was built on the charity of the very immigrants his family now scorned. The temptation burned in her throat, but she thought of the security guard who'd smiled at her this morning despite the headlines, the Nigerian cleaner in O'Hara Technologies who'd whispered, "Stay strong, sister," the Polish programmer whose children went to good schools because of his steady job, all of them hanging by threads that her next words could sever. "Mrs. O'Sullivan writes," Imir continued, her voice catching, "about the Ireland she saw changing around her, about young people getting opportunities she never had. She writes about a student she met at Mass in Galway in 1997, brilliant but poor, from a family that couldn't support his education." Declan's head lifted. His eyes met hers across the chamber, and in them she saw pleading, terror, and something else. Genuine love, perhaps, or merely desperation. Did it matter which? She and another nurse, my mother, Rosa Santos, they pooled their wages. Week after week they paid for his books, his accommodation, his chance at university. They never asked for repayment. They never sought recognition. They simply believed that talent shouldn't be wasted for lack of opportunity. A committee member interrupted. "Ms. Santos, these are lovely sentiments, but we're here to investigate financial irregularities, not charitable acts from decades ago. Does this letter contain relevant information about Mr. O'Hara's current business practices?" Imir's throat tightened. This was the moment. She could read the rest. The part where Mrs. O'Sullivan mentioned Thomas Brennan, the fisherman father, the fabricated O'Hara lineage. She could watch this entire aristocratic facade crumble. Instead, she carefully folded the letter, keeping the damaging paragraphs hidden. "What it contains," she said slowly, "is a reminder that we all stand on the shoulders of people whose names we've forgotten, that wealth and poverty are often separated by nothing more than chance and kindness, that perhaps," her voice broke, "perhaps we should judge people not by where they started, but by whether they honor those who helped them rise. Are you protecting your husband, Ms. Santos?" another TD asked sharply. "Is this testimony influenced by your personal relationship?" "I'm protecting the truth," Imir said quietly. "The whole truth, which is that my husband built a successful company that employs over 2,000 people, that his personal life, however scandalous you find it, doesn't negate his professional achievements, and that maybe, just maybe, this committee's time would be better spent investigating actual corruption rather than persecuting an immigrant woman for daring to marry above her station." The chamber erupted. Some TDs shouted support, others outrage. Reporters typed frantically. In the gallery, Maura Ní Riain sat frozen, her face unreadable. Siobhan beside her looked almost impressed despite herself. The chairman banged his gavel. "Miss Santos, you're under oath. I'll ask you directly. Does that letter contain information suggesting Mr. O'Hara has misrepresented his background or financial history?" Emir met his eyes. "It contains a dying woman's wish that we show more kindness to each other. Nothing more. It was a lie, but it was also mercy. And sometimes," Imir was learning, "mercy was the highest form of truth." The chairman studied her for a long moment, then turned to Declan. "Mr. O'Hara, you have an extraordinary wife. I hope you deserve her." He shuffled his papers. "This committee finds insufficient evidence of wrongdoing to proceed with formal charges. However, we recommend an independent audit of O'Hara Technologies' tax arrangements. You're dismissed." The gavel came down with finality. The chamber of Leinster House plunged into absolute silence. Imir's voice echoed trembling but firm as she read the elderly woman's letter. "Use your wealth not to crush, but to protect. Don't forget who cleaned the floor behind you when you dreamed big. Honor the carers, the nurses, the forgotten ones." Maura, seated at the back, let out a muffled sob. For the first time, her gaze was not one of contempt, but of shame. Siobhan, the daughter, looked away, unable to sustain her own revolt. The elderly woman's text not only defended Imir, but exposed the moral emptiness of the entire family. Declan lowered his head, tears discreetly streaming down. The entire parliament awaited his response. It would be easier to deny, to blame Ymir, to preserve the company. But he stood and said, "I am not the man I pretend to be. Not even the name I carry is whole. The time has come to return what was never mine alone." The chairman banged his gavel. "Then, Mr. O'Hara, are you prepared to announce your decision before the nation?" The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Every eye in the chamber fixed on Declan as he stood at the witness table, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Outside, through the tall windows, Dublin carried on, buses rumbling down Kildare Street, tourists photographing government buildings, ordinary life continuing whilst inside, a man prepared to dismantle his own legacy. Ymir watched from her seat, the letter still clutched in her trembling hands. She had given him an escape, protected his darkest secret, chosen mercy over vengeance. Now the choice was his. Would he honor that sacrifice, or would he retreat back into the comfortable lies that had sustained him for 47 years? Declan cleared his throat, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. "Chairman, members of the committee, people of Ireland," his voice cracked on the last words. "I've spent my entire life building something I thought was mine. O'Hara Technologies, the O'Hara name, the O'Hara legacy. But standing here today, I realize I've been living inside a story someone else wrote for me." Maura made a small, desperate sound from the gallery. Declan's eyes found hers briefly, and something passed between them. Not love, but a shared understanding of what was about to be lost. "My success," Declan continued, "was never mine alone. It was purchased with the wages of a hospital cleaner and an immigrant nurse who saw potential in a poor student and chose kindness over self-preservation. It was built on a foundation of lies about lineage and belonging, lies designed to make me acceptable to a society that valued bloodlines over character." A journalist in the press gallery gasped. This was better than anyone had hoped for. A real-time confession, a powerful man voluntarily destroying himself on national television. "The truth is," Declan said, his voice gaining strength, "I'm not an O'Hara by birth. My real father was Thomas Brennan, a fisherman from Connemara who died without ever holding his son. The family that raised me erased him from history because his poverty embarrassed them. They gave me their name, their opportunities, their respectability, and in doing so, taught me that some lives matter more than others, that some people deserve to be remembered whilst others should be grateful to be forgotten." Siobhan stood abruptly in the gallery, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She pushed past other spectators, heading for the exit, but Maura remained frozen, tears streaming down her weathered face, the carefully constructed facade of decades crumbling in real time. "I married Ymir Santos," Declan said, and for the first time, warmth entered his voice. "Because she saw me. Not the CEO, not the name, not the wealth. She saw a man who was tired of pretending, and rather than demand I become someone else, she loved me as I was. That terrified me, because if she could love the real me, the bastard son of a fisherman, raised on charity, then what did that say about all the years I'd spent running from that truth?" Ymir's vision blurred with tears. This was not the testimony she'd expected. This was not protection or calculation. This was something rawer, more dangerous: honesty. "So yes, Chairman," Declan said, turning back to face the committee. "I'm prepared to announce my decision. Effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO of O'Hara Technologies. I'm establishing a foundation in the name of Kathleen O'Sullivan and Rosa Santos, a fund to support immigrants pursuing education in Ireland. And I'm donating 40% of my personal shares in the company to that foundation, to be administered by a board that includes representatives from the migrant communities who built this country whilst we pretended they didn't exist." The chamber erupted. Some committee members applauded. Others shouted objections about shareholder rights and fiduciary duty. Reporters scrambled for the doors, racing to file stories. But Ymir heard none of it. She was watching Declan's face, seeing him truly for perhaps the first time. Not powerful, not broken, but simply human. The chairman banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. When the noise finally subsided, he spoke with unusual gentleness. "Mr. O'Hara, this committee cannot compel you to take such dramatic action. Are you certain this is your choice?" Declan looked at Ymir. Their eyes met across the formal space, across the gulf of everything that had happened and everything that might still come. "It's not my choice," he said quietly. "It's my debt. Long overdue." The session ended in chaos. Security had to escort both Declan and Ymir out through back corridors to avoid the press scrum. They found themselves in a small anonymous hallway, alone for the first time since the funeral. The silence between them felt vast. "You didn't have to do that," Ymir finally whispered. "Yes, I did," Declan replied. "Because you showed me mercy when I deserved none, and because," his voice broke, "because I'm tired, Ymir. Tired of being someone I'm not. Tired of defending the indefensible. Tired of living in fear that someone will discover the truth. You freed me today. The least I could do was return the favor." Ymir reached for his hand. His fingers were cold, trembling. "What happens now?" "I don't know," he admitted. "The board will likely force me out entirely. The family will never forgive me. The papers will crucify us both for months. But maybe," he looked at her, truly looked at her, "maybe we can finally start telling the truth. About everything." They stood in that forgotten hallway, two people who'd somehow found each other across impossible divides, holding on whilst the world outside raged and judged and demanded answers neither of them had. Days later, Dublin stopped to hear the press conference broadcast on all the radio stations. Declan O'Hara announced his resignation, donating part of the company's shares to a fund in the name of the deceased elderly woman, destined for nurses and carers. The shock ran through the country. The most powerful man in Irish technology was surrendering his crown in the name of dignity. Ymir received no fortune, no inheritance. She received only silence and discretion, choosing to rebuild her life away from the spotlight. But at Glasnevin, before the elderly woman's grave, she lived the most unexpected moment. Mora ní Riain, the same woman who had humiliated her, approached with trembling steps, holding the rosary that had broken at the funeral. Restored with new thread, it was delicately placed in Ymir's hands. "She wanted it to be yours," the mother-in-law murmured, before walking away. The cold wind swept through the cemetery, carrying away the last dry leaves of autumn. Ymir closed her eyes and clutched the rosary, finally understanding. Victory was not in proving she was right, but in remaining standing when everyone tried to bring her down. Life would go on, not as a fairy tale, but as a path marked by scars and dignity. The weeks that followed Declan's resignation were brutal. The Irish Times ran editorials debating whether his gesture was noble sacrifice or calculated damage control. Financial analysts predicted O'Hara Technologies would collapse without his leadership. Social media split into camps, some praising his courage, others condemning him as a traitor to his class. The company's share price plummeted, then slowly stabilized as the new CEO, a woman from a working-class Cork family, proved unexpectedly competent. Ymir returned to work, not at O'Hara Technologies but at a community health center in Finglas. The pay was less than half what she'd earned as a secretary, but the patients, mostly immigrants and elderly Irish, treated her with a warmth she'd never experienced in the corporate towers of Dublin's Docklands. She took the bus each morning, grateful for anonymity, for the ordinary rhythm of making tea and filing paperwork, and listening to people's small, enormous worries. Declan sold the Ballsbridge penthouse and moved to a modest flat in Stoneybatter. He consulted occasionally for technology startups, but mostly he seemed content to fade into obscurity. They saw each other on weekends, taking long walks along the Liffey, navigating the strange new landscape of their marriage without the weight of empire crushing them. Siobhan didn't speak to either of them. She'd moved to London, taking a position at a merchant bank, reportedly telling friends her father had suffered a breakdown. Ymir felt no anger towards her, only a distant sadness for a young woman who'd been taught that love was conditional on status, that family was performance rather than truth. It was 3 months after the hearing when Ymir received the call from Father Kieran. Mora ní Riain wanted to see her, not at the family's Killiney mansion, but at Glasnevin Cemetery, at Kathleen O'Sullivan's grave. Ymir almost refused. The wounds were too fresh, the humiliation still vivid, but something in the priest's voice, a gentle insistence, made her agree. The November afternoon was gray and cold as Ymir walked through the cemetery's Victorian gates. She found Mora standing before the simple headstone, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, looking smaller somehow, diminished by months of shame and loss. They stood in silence for a long moment, two women on opposite sides of a gulf that had swallowed everything familiar. Finally, Mora reached into her handbag and withdrew the rosary, the same one that had broken at the funeral, scattering beads across the chapel floor like prophecy. I had it repaired, Maura said, her voice barely above a whisper, at a shop in Temple Bar. The woman who fixed it was Romanian. She told me her mother had taught her the craft, that prayer beads should never be thrown away, only healed. She held it out to Imir. Kathleen left instructions. She wanted you to have this. Imir's hands shook as she accepted it. The beads were smooth, worn by decades of desperate prayers. The new thread was barely visible, stronger than what had been there before. I was wrong, Maura said, and the words seemed to cost her everything. About you. About what you wanted. About, her voice cracked, about everything. I spent my whole life building walls to keep out people I deemed unworthy, and in the end those walls imprisoned me. My son lost his identity. My granddaughter lost her compassion. And she looked at Imir directly for the first time. I became the villain in a story I thought I was protecting. Tears streamed down the older woman's face. Decades of rigid control finally breaking. Kathleen knew. She watched me erase Thomas Brennan from our family history, watched me teach Declan to be ashamed of his origins, watched me turn love into transaction. And still, when she died, she left that letter defending me, defending us, showing more mercy than we ever showed anyone. Imir clutched the rosary, feeling the weight of it. Not just beads and thread, but the accumulated prayers of a woman who'd cleaned floors and changed bedpans and still found space in her heart for generosity. Why are you telling me this? Because, Maura said, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief embroidered with her initials, I need you to know that you won, not by destroying us, though you could have, but by being better than we deserved. And because, she hesitated, because if there's any chance of redemption for this family, it starts with saying the words, I'm sorry, I was wrong, and thank you for showing us there's another way to live. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the graves of Dublin's dead, centuries of Irish men and women, immigrants and natives, rich and poor, all equal finally in the democracy of death. Imir looked at the rosary in her hands, at the elderly woman who'd died clutching secrets, at Maura standing vulnerable and broken before her. She could hold on to anger. It would be justified, earned, righteous. Or she could do what Kathleen had done, choose mercy even when it was undeserved, especially when it was undeserved. Thank you, Imir said quietly, for bringing this to me. Maura nodded, unable to speak. She turned to leave, then paused. Would you and Declan consider joining me for Christmas dinner? Nothing grand, just family, whatever that means now. Imir met her eyes. I'll ask him. After Maura left, Imir remained at the grave. She ran her fingers over the rosary beads, each one a prayer, a hope, a small act of faith that the world could be gentler than it was. The inscription on Kathleen's headstone was simple. She gave more than she kept. As Imir walked back through Glasnevin's gates past the round tower and the graves of Irish heroes, she understood something fundamental had shifted. Not forgiveness, that would take time, might never fully arrive, but something subtler, the recognition that people are capable of change, that cruelty often stems from fear, that the hardest battles are won not by destroying your enemies, but by refusing to become them. Her phone buzzed. A text from Declan. Dinner tonight? Nothing fancy. I'll cook. She smiled, typing back. Perfect. The bus arrived, crowded with evening commuters heading home from work. Imir found a seat by the window, the rosary warm in her pocket. Outside, Dublin glowed in the gathering dusk, imperfect, complicated hers, not because she'd conquered it or been accepted by it, but because she'd survived it, had remained herself despite everything that tried to reshape her into something smaller, quieter, more acceptable. The greatest victory, she thought, watching the city lights blur past, wasn't in being loved or vindicated or proven right. It was simply in remaining standing, scarred, changed, but still yourself when the world had every reason to believe you'd break. And that, perhaps, was enough. In the end, what remained weren't the scandals, the gossip, or the open wounds, but the proof that dignity can endure even when everything seems lost. How many times in life are we judged without anyone knowing the truth? How many times does silence weigh more than any word? And if you were in her place, would you have the courage to face everyone's stares? Or would you have stayed silent to avoid losing everything? Perhaps the great lesson lies precisely there. It's not about winning with applause, but about remaining standing even when the entire world tries to bend us. Because in the end, the only wealth no one can take from us is the courage to be faithful to who we truly are. If this story touched you, like it, share it with someone who needs to hear this today, and don't forget to subscribe to follow the next stories that will move your heart.